Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to those of you who are online as well. Sometimes I forget to say that, but we do have people out there watching in cyberspace too. So, this is our last class on Bereshit. If you remember, all the way back to the beginning. Bereshit, the first word there on the right-hand side, means in the beginning. Or if you're Greek, we're in Genesis. It occurred to me this morning, I should have put a copy of the Septuagint up there instead of an English translation. And then we would have had both Hebrew and Greek. But anyhow, Bereshit or Genesis, whichever one you prefer. Today, we're going to look at the last 3 chapters. We should be pretty good with time since we've only got 3 chapters to cover. 48 through 50. And I thought I would begin with just a little bit of geographical review here. As you remember, we've been in that last of the 10 Toledotes since chapter 37, I believe it is. 37:2 says, and this is the generation of Joseph. That was the last of the 10 different generations that are listed in the book. And so it's about a third of the book that concerns Jacob and Joseph and the brothers and all. So over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about, initially Joseph being taken into slavery, and then all the things that happened with his dream interpretations, and then last week more with him being reunited with his brothers and then with his father. So this is just a nice little schematic that kind of puts it all together as to where this stuff happened. When Joseph went up to see the brothers and they threw him in the pit, they were living. Let's go back and do my glasses so I can see. They were living around Hebron, but they had gone up near Shechem in the north to take the sheep. And when he got up there, he didn't find them there, the brothers. So he said, "Where are they?" And so he said, "Oh, they're up in Dothan." So he went further up here to the north. This is Dothan right up here. And that's where, he showed up wearing his fancy coat and everything and told them about his dreams. And they didn't like that too much, so they sold him to the Midianites that were coming through. And so they come down. This is kind of the way of the sea. It comes down, and somewhere along in here, it's kind of confusing as they get, he gets handed over from Midianites to Ishmaelites, but anyhow, he gets taken to Egypt and winds up way down here in the upper right-hand corner of Egypt at Hierapolis. Hierapolis is also known as On. And as you'll recall, his wife was the daughter of the priest of On. So this is where he gets taken to, where everything happens with the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and all those guys in the prison. And then later on, where he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. So that's Joseph's trek. And then as he gets reunited with his brothers, of course, he wants to see his daddy again. So he tells them, "Go get my dad and bring him down." First Benjamin, then the father. And so Jacob leaves Hebron. He's still up there. Stops at Beersheba. You might remember this. Has another time of worship there. Builds an altar and worships at Beersheba along the way. And then he comes up and down all the way to the same area. This whole area being known as Goshen, where they wind up settling. Jacob, the other 11 brothers, and all of their assorted family members and herds and everything associated with them. So that's kind of the last couple of weeks that we've looked at with Joseph. And then today we're going to start in chapter 48. This is where Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are blessed by Jacob. And I think I'm actually going to read a little bit of this since we have a little more time than we usually do. So let's look at chapter 48. I'll pick it up about verse 3. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of people, and you will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are mine. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "These are my sons whom God has given me." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought him near them, and he blessed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face again. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So, some interesting things that come out of this little section with the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. The first thing I wanted to point out was that, remember back in verse 3, he said, he reminds Joseph that God Almighty appeared to him that was. That's Bethel. So that's where earlier, I forget which chapter it was. Might have written it down. I don't think I wrote it down. But anyhow, it's chapter 25, verses 9 through 15. 35, 9 through 15, where he was going up to Mesopotamia, and he had one of those theophanies where he has an experience with God, and he builds the altar. And, the place was called Luz, but afterwards Joseph said it's going to be called Bethel now because it's the house of God. Bethel meaning Beth meaning house. And then in verse 5, this is very significant. Verse 5, he says, "And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are mine." Now, Reuben and Simeon, they were Reuben's firstborn, right? Simeon was second. His real children, but he's saying that Ephraim and Manasseh, they're going to be mine too. This is basically, he's adopting them as his own, Jacob is, as his own children, which means that they are going to be able to participate in the inheritance, just as the other 12 boys are. So this is a really significant thing that he's saying that the two of them will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. And we have this instance here of where the hands get crossed. Joseph brings them to them and sets it all up nice and proper so he can bless Manasseh since he was the firstborn, but he winds up crossing his hands and blessing Ephraim instead, which is, again, a constant thing that we've seen all throughout this book, where the younger gets blessed instead of the one who's supposed to get blessed. Remember Bakora? Anybody remember what Bakora was? The right of the firstborn? That's always the firstborn is supposed to get half the inheritance, and then the rest of it goes to however many other there are. In this case, 11. But not so, because he places Ephraim over Manasseh. And in fact, later on, you probably remember, as you get into the kings and the divided kingdom and all of that, Ephraim really becomes a synonym for the entire northern kingdom. All 10 tribes are often referred to, particularly in the minor prophets, as Ephraim. So these two guys really get some elevation here in terms of being blessed by Joseph. Okay, so what I leave out? Verse 6. Verse 6 is interesting, I think. A little insight. We'll give these little hints of insight. And the children that you father after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. So evidently, there were other brothers besides just Manasseh and Ephraim. We don't know who they were. We don't know, when they were born, anything like that. But Joseph had been married at this point 25 years. So it wouldn't be surprising he had more than 2 kids, right? But Ephraim and Manasseh are the two that are kind of critical to the story of the development of the nation of Israel. And that's why we hear about them more so than anyone else. Let's see.
I have a question.
Sure.
In 48:12, it says Joseph removed, yours may not read like this. Joseph removed them from Israel's knees, as if they're very young children, but they can't be that young.
No, they are, I'm not sure exactly how old they are. They're not little boys.
No, but they were born before the years of famine came, back in
Right.
41:50. The years of famine came, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph.
Right. So they're I would guess, I've never really looked it up, but probably guessing in their teens maybe. Mm-hmm. But this idea of being on the knees, that's more of a being prostrate, to receive the blessing. It's kind of a formal sort of thing to receive the blessing. You're right, they weren't just like little boys or anything. In verse 7, he refers to Rachel briefly. He says, when I was still, as for me, when I came from Padan to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And the word that's used there that speaks of his grief for Rachel is similar to 42:36, which I think, this is where the boys come back and they're wanting to take Benjamin, and Jacob says, okay, I've already lost Joseph. Now Simeon's locked up, and now you want me to give up him, and he's bereaved, he's grieving. That's the same word used here about his feeling for Rachel as he's coming back. In fact, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but surprising to me, he doesn't want to be buried with Rachel, but he winds up getting buried somewhere else. And then in verse 8, you can certainly see his age coming into play, and the text even says that he's basically blind. The boys come in, who are these? I can't really see who they are. So he has to ask Joseph who the boys are. And then in verse 15, this is really kind of an interesting quirk of Scripture, I think. Let's go back to it. This is where the actual blessing occurs. It says, and he blessed Joseph and said all this stuff. Well, thought he was blessing the boys, but this says he blessed Joseph. And I meant to look this up this morning. I forgot to, but most of your translations will say he blessed Joseph because it's coming from the Masoretic text. Masoretic text, I think, you remember, Bob, when it was written about, is it like, I want to say like, not 17, like 700 AD somewhere? It's on this side of the cross. It's in the probably first 1,000 years AD that the Masoretes actually got us the text that we use today, the Hebrew text that we use for the Old Testament. But if you look at older versions like the Septuagint in Greek or the Syriac version from Syria or the Vulgate that's in Latin, they all say he blessed the boys, the brothers, not that he blessed Joseph. So I'm not sure why the Masoretes did it like that, but that's certainly a lot more recent translation that is in disagreement with the older ones that they would have had, back in Greek and other times, yes.
And do you think it's possible that, he's about to bless all the boys?
Yeah.
So Joseph's one of the boys, and so he blessed Joseph.
Well, it could be kind of inclusive, I guess, an overall blessing, because Joseph kind of gets blessed through the brothers. But he even says, if you look at the blessing, it becomes pretty clear there that he says, bless the boys in verse 16. So I think this is pretty clearly the blessing for Manasseh and Ephraim, although Joseph is mentioned in the Masoretic text, which is why our Bibles say that. And let's see what else we have in here.
Richard?
Yes,
Did Joseph end up buying all the property that Pharaoh owned? Is that? Joseph
didn't per se, but Pharaoh, he made this deal when the famine was there that they would give their land in exchange for grain. So Pharaoh wound up owning the whole place.
Well, I thought Joseph back then.
Joseph was managing. Joseph was his administrator, if you will. But it really belonged, I think, to the Pharaoh himself. But it was Joseph's plan to do that, and it worked out pretty well for Pharaoh. He came out pretty good on that deal. Wound up with all of the livestock and all the land and everything. Okay, the last thing that we'll look at in this chapter, this is another one that's kind of an interesting quirk too, is verse 22, just kind of thrown in there, where it says, I'm looking at the wrong chapter, 149, 48:22. Here it is. Moreover, this is kind of the end of the blessing. Moreover, I have given to you rather than to your brothers, and he's talking to Joseph here. I've given to you rather than to your brothers one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Excuse me. When did that happen? Anybody heard that one before? It just kind of comes out of nowhere. And it's interesting. There are several different explanations for this. I'm not really sure. The most logical thing is that the word there for the mountain slope is the word Shechem, which sounds an awful lot like Shechem. Yeah, Shechem. Yeah. In fact, it's the same word that's used for the town of Shechem, and it means a mountain slope. Actually, it means shoulder. And if you think about it, your shoulder looks kind of like a mountain slope, right? So that's kind of where the etiology of the word comes from. But so some people think this is referring back to 33:19. If you'll recall, he bought some land from Hamor, the son of Shechem, at that point. It doesn't say it's a mountain slope or anything like that. It doesn't say anything about killing Amorites either. But some people think this could be referring back to that, since it's Shechem and Shechem, kind of alliterate there a little bit. The other more interesting explanation, although I'm still having a little hard time getting my head around this, Robert Alter is a very good Hebrew exegete, and I've been using his commentary along with two others to kind of prepare for class. And he thinks that can't be, and he makes an argument based on grammar that Shechem is a feminine word, and the word here is Shechem, ahad. Ahad is the number 1, and ahad is masculine. So you can't have a masculine one with a feminine word that it's modifying. It would have to be ahat, which would be a feminine form. So he kind of discounts it at Shechem because of that, but he comes up with this crazy idea that it's in some way not necessarily referring to a place, but referring to the conditions of things. And he points to the only other place in the Bible where this is used is Zephaniah 3:9. And I should have marked this because it'll take me the rest of the class to find Zephaniah. We'll look at it quickly here. Zephaniah 3:9. Here we go. Okay, Zechariah. Zechariah is bigger than Zephaniah, right? Here he is. Zephaniah 3 verse 9 says, "For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord." That one accord is atah shahem, the same words exactly. And so author thinks that he's really talking about the fact that Joseph is going to have this over the brothers with one accord in some way, like using it as an adverb. I'm still having a little bit of a hard time getting my head around it, but I understand his grammar point's pretty good because it's just like English. If you have got nouns and verbs and subjects, they have to match. You have to have a, well, these days I guess you can pick your own pronouns, but usually you just have a his if it was a boy and a her if it was a girl. So traditionally anyway. Question?
Billy's using the NIV.
Yeah, what's it say?
It says to serve him shoulder to shoulder.
Okay, there you go. So that's the altar concept, to serve shoulder to shoulder or with one accord. So, and that comes from the fact that it's used that way in Zephaniah 3:9. So this is kind of an interesting take. I'm not sure we know exactly which one is right, but I read that and I thought, where did this ever happen? They beat up Amorites with the sword and got a mountain slope. I mean, there's nothing about that anywhere here, right? Okay, so this is what Mr. Rembrandt thought this looked like. And it does look like little boys here, doesn't it, Bill? And he even put Joseph's wife in here, which clearly she's not in the text, but I guess he felt like she belonged there. Maybe she was there. I mean, it's a pretty big occasion for your kids to be blessed by Jacob, right? So maybe she was there. Who knows?
But Jacob was down there 17 years.
Yeah.
And they were born before the famine started, so they would have been.
They had to
closer
be
to 20.
teenagers. Yeah. They had to be teenagers. And let's see. So, any questions on 48? We're going to move on to 49. I'm going to move pretty quickly through 49 because this is the actual blessings on the different sons of Jacob. Any questions on 48? Okay, in 49, we have, and Jacob called his sons and said, gather yourselves together, and I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. And then he goes through the list, really in birth order, starting with Reuben and all the way down, with blessings. Now, as you read some of them, they sound more like curses than blessings, right? Especially for the first few. So I just kind of pulled out a little bit on each one. Reuben shall not have preeminence. This is an important point, and this is in verse 4. Let's back up to verse 3. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity, preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it, you went up to my couch. So what he's referring to here is when Reuben slept with his concubine. And so Reuben, basically, who by Bakora, the right of the firstborn, should have had half the inheritance, forfeited it because of what he did with Jacob's concubine. And he's kind of nailing it for him right here. The next two, of course, were also in a little bit of trouble. Simeon and Levi. Anybody remember what they got involved with?
When Dinah was abused.
They were the ones that plundered the people in Shechem, right? When Dinah was abused. And so he says, read it here. You'll be divided and scattered. It's interesting. We'll look at some maps later, but Reuben and Simeon, on one of my maps, Simeon looks fairly big, but it's mostly desert area. On another one, it's much smaller, which may be the functional part of Simeon. Reuben's pretty small too, and Reuben historically didn't last very long. He got overran pretty bad. But Levi didn't get any ground at all, right? Levi, that's the priest. They didn't get any land. There's not a tribe of Levi. It's just Simeon and Reuben. And theirs are pretty short shrift. So it really picks up with Judah. The fourth one down, we begin to get some real blessings here now rather than this kind of pseudo blessings. Let's see what I want to start reading. Let's go to verse 8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my sons, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So Judah now is actually getting blessed. Not first son, not second son, not third son, but fourth son, Judah. And when he says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, the scepter was the identification of royalty. The king kept the scepter. And all of the kings, Saul, David, Solomon, everybody else after that, including Jesus many, many years later, all come from the tribe of Judah. So he's kind of pointing out here that Judah is going to be the tribe that all of the royalty in Israel will come from. He also says, it's interesting, in verse 8, my version says praise. Does anybody else have anything there besides praise? I'm sure that's Masoretic text again. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. The Hebrew really is something more like acclaim you. In other words, declare you as royal. More so than like, oh yay, Joseph, like that kind of praise. It's more like they're going to recognize your royal status among everybody else. Okay, others that are listed are just kind of quirky little blessings, if you think about it. I mean, like next one is Zebulun's going to dwell by the sea in verse 13. Well, I guess that's nice. We've got beachfront property, right? But one of the other ones is actually closer to the sea. Zebulun is. Asher actually is geographically closer to the Mediterranean than this one, but that was his blessing. So he got that. Issachar became a servant at forced labor. This is in verse 15. This is thought to refer to the fact that Issachar is kind of over on the Mediterranean coast, near where some of the Philistine towns are, and they were kind of warlike people, and they may have kind of captured or enslaved some of the people of Issachar at some point in time. That may be what that's referring to. Dan shall judge his people in verse 16. This is another kind of interesting quirk of the Hebrew language. Unlike our language that's pretty clear about word order and subjects and verbs and objects and things like that, Hebrew, it's a pretty sparse language. They use very few words. And the problem with that is that it can mean almost anything. And one of the problems here is that my version reads, Dan shall judge his people. That's probably what most of your versions read, I would guess. But you could look at that in Hebrew and equally well read it as, Dan shall the people judge. In other words, Dan can be the object rather than the subject, because you just can't tell. It can be read either way. And either one would be appropriate in their language. And the latter way actually kind of makes a little bit more sense if you recall what happened to Dan. And if you want to read later, I think this is Judges 18. They were given a piece of land in the south, kind of west, near the sea, and it didn't go too well. There were some warring tribes, so they wound up moving way up north to the old town of Laish and taking it. And that's where Dan is today. If you go to Israel today, Dan is way up there, not down south where it used to be. So they kind of got relocated themselves because of all of the trouble that they had in the neighborhood that they were in. Gad shall be raided and raid. This is verse 19. But he shall raid at their heels. You know, that kind of has a little bit of Genesis imagery in there from the garden, the snake and biting the heel, that sort of thing. So, I don't know if that's what's meant to be coming through there or not, but it kind of reminds you of that. Asher's food shall be rich, in verse 20. Naphtali bears beautiful thongs, in verse 21. Again, these are kind of obscure blessings, right? They're not anything to really write home about. Joseph's branches run over the wall, in verse 22. Again, you see there the archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved, his arms were made agile. And then finally, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. Benjamin as a tribe was really small. We'll see it on the map in a few minutes, but they were known for being pretty ferocious people. I mean, to be a small tribe, they really were pretty good at warfare. And so this idea of Benjamin being a ravenous wolf really does fit with the history of what comes later. So these are the blessings that we have for Jacob's sons. Did I leave anything out?
Richard,
Yes.
when he took the two sons of Joseph, he didn't bless them in this group here. He didn't give them anything like that.
This is kind of, I guess, in addition to that, because the other one in 48 is the blessing for the two sons, for Ephraim and Manasseh. Back over in
Yeah, but
48.
if he was treating them as his own sons, wouldn't he have blessed them here too?
Well, I think because he already had, this is like an addendum. This is like,
Okay.
I've already done you two, now here's your 12 brothers. You know, that's gonna be blessed too. I think that's the way it's supposed to be seen as. I was just looking to see if I had anything else in here that didn't. I think we covered it. Oh, I did mention back in the first part of the blessing to Judah. That was 10, right? Verse 9, Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you've gone up. He stooped down and crouched as a lion, as a lioness. Who dares tempt him? That's a real big theme. We sing Judah, Lion of Judah, right? Even today. And that was a big thing back then. Lions were pretty common. They weren't the big collared ones like the African lions that we think about. They were more like mountain lions, little smaller, scrawnier lions. But they're all over Israel. I mean, there were a lot of those things. And they could be pretty dangerous too. I mean, obviously, they're hungry. They like to eat, and they eat people. So this idea of lion, we'll look at some images in a minute of lions as, a lot of times they were used as images of military might. You'll see that some with Nebuchadnezzar, King Tut, and others. But that's a classic image of Judah as the Lion of Judah, and really referring basically to Jesus ultimately as being the Lion of Judah.
Richard, do you think that verse 11 is referring to Christ?
And you know, I read that this morning again, and I thought that sounds awfully messianic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It really does. I mean, it's not very clear, but binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's coat to the choice vine, he's washed his, that's what got me, he's washed his garments in wine by being washed in the blood. You know, that does sound very messianic. None of the commentaries I read said anything about that being a messianic reference, but it just, that's the first thing I thought of when I read it too. So it does sound an awful lot like that. Okay, so at the end of 49, we have Jacob's death and burial. He checks it on the time. 11 o'clock, good. He asked to be buried with his fathers. This is over in verse 29. 49, 29. Then he commanded and said to them, I'm to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, in the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with him the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. So you probably remember we talked about that several weeks ago. It's chapter 23, if you want to go back and look at it. Abraham at the time was living in Hebron, and so this is around that area. Mamre, Hebron, kind of sometimes used somewhat interchangeably as place names. So he wants to go back and be buried there. In that specific case, Abraham's buried there, Sarah's buried there, Isaac and Rebekah are buried there, and Leah is buried there. And I just thought it was interesting that he didn't want to be buried with Rachel. But Rachel, you know, she had kind of an untimely death in childbirth on the way back and didn't make it to Bethlehem. So maybe there wasn't enough room where she got buried. Who knows? But you would think, as much as he loved Rachel, you'd think he'd want to be buried with Rachel, right? But no, he's buried with Abraham and Isaac and their wives, and Leah, his wife. Okay, so here's some of that geography I was talking about. I've got another one later that's probably a little bit better. In this one, Simeon looks kind of big, but again, a lot of this is Negev, so it's pretty much desert, and it's much smaller in the next one. Reuben is over here, but you can see Manasseh got a pretty good chunk of land, and Ephraim did too, just north of Benjamin there. Manasseh has some on the other side of the Jordan as well, so that's pretty good allotment of land. Remember, the promise was two things, right? Land and children. Those are the two things that were promised to Abraham by God from the very beginning. And we're seeing that come about. This is just interesting. These are some mosaics, stained glass mosaics by a guy named Mark Chagall, who created one for each one of the 12 sons of Joseph. And they're just kind of interesting to look at. If you go to Jerusalem, there's a hospital there. What's the name of this thing? Hassa Ein Karim Hospital in Jerusalem. You go into their little chapel, and these things go around the room, all 12 of them. And they're really beautiful pictures, but he designed each one to kind of reflect the qualities of that particular son of Jacob. And these are just a couple of other paintings that show artist renditions of Jacob on his deathbed, more or less, blessing the sons, and over here as well. So that's more of a black and white. So here's a line. This thing actually comes from 605 to 562 BC. I mean, that covers the period of time that Babylon took Israel into captivity. It's that old. It's from Nebuchadnezzar II's time. And you can go to the Waterschleiches Museum in Berlin if you'd like to see that. It's in there. My German's pretty bad after all these years.
But that's an African lion there.
Well, that was, this is Nebuchadnezzar. It does look more like it's got the collar on it, right?
Oh,
So,
definitely.
yeah, as opposed to what we see in Judah. Right. This one is actually from King Tut's tomb. They put a date on it. This is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. You've probably been there, right? I bet you have. I figured it. And this looks,
then the one in Berlin, too.
yeah, and this, oh, you've been there too. So, again, 49:9 is where we have that reference to the line of Judah. This looks more like what we're talking about than that first one with Nebuchadnezzar. And what is this? I forgot. Oh, this is Rembrandt's rendering of the death of Jacob as he's dying. All the kids are gathered around crying. All right, last chapter. Woohoo! Any questions on 49? That's pretty quick, I know, but it's just kind of straightforward lessons. So chapter 50 has to do with initially Jacob's burial. Interestingly, the first thing that we get in verse 1 is that Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Well, yeah, it's a funeral, so we cry at funerals, right? But Joseph just seems to be a real emotional kind of guy, right? First he cried over Benjamin, then he cried over, 5 minutes. Then he cried over the brothers, and now he's crying over his daddy. So I don't know, Joseph just seems to be a pretty emotional kind of guy to me. They embalmed him over 40 days. We'll look at some embalming here in a second. And then even the Egyptians mourned for him for 70 days. Now those two periods of time are not consecutive, they're concurrent. So that happened over the same period of time. But Joseph asked Pharaoh to go take him back to Canaan like he requested. They leave the children, the flocks behind in verse 8, and the whole adult people go off up to Canaan to bury Jacob. Now my question is, who's the babysitter? And why do you think they left the children behind?
They've come back.
I think that's right. I think Pharaoh's probably like, you guys gotta go up there and stay, you know, not come back. So probably it was kind of like a little bit of a bribe to make sure that they came back. And Joseph himself mourned for 7 days, we see in verse 10. This is an artist's rendition of that. Same process. Now, here's some pictures of Egyptian embalming. This guy, Seti the First, is from the 13th century BC. He's in pretty good shape. And over here, this is the mummy of Maya-Therpri, whoever he is, during the reign of Thutmose IV, which is about 14th century BC. If you ever go to the Vatican, there's a lady in there who's 4,000 years old. She's red-headed. She's an Egyptian lady with red hair. I think that's kind of weird. Never seen a red-headed Egyptian. She dyed her hair or what, but she's 4,000 years old. And I'm here to tell you, she looks pretty good. I mean, she looks like she's going to open her eyes and start talking to you any minute. It's kind of eerie. But she's 4,000 years old. That's how good they were at embalming things. She's still there today. Pretty amazing.
Our term for embalming doesn't mean the same as their term, because they use a lot of.
Oh, they have a very extensive process.
Right.
Much so more so than what we do.
Right.
Which is why they last thousands of years.
Right.
Pretty amazing. Here's another one. And then this is kind of, they talked about putting him in a coffin, putting Joseph in a coffin in Egypt. This is kind of the thing that they would have put him into to preserve him. So chapter 50, God's providence here. This is the last part. Joseph's brothers begin to worry about their fate. You know, now that Jacob's gone, what's he going to do to us now? We've already seen this once before, right? When they were going, you're in trouble now because you're the guy and we're not. But Joseph is still pretty magnanimous. They even offer to be servants in verse 8. They don't say, you know, we're your brothers. We're God's servants. You know, we're just going to serve God with you. But Jacob, very magnanimously, in verse 19 says, do not fear. I'm at the place of God. I'll provide for you and your little ones. So Joseph is pretty good about this whole thing and not having any retribution or anything like that against his brothers for what happened when they sold him into slavery.
17, he wept to keep him.
That's what I was
Yeah,
gonna say.
yeah. He's always crying. Always crying. And then in, further down, we have the death of Joseph. He remained in Egypt. He lived 110 years. It's kind of interesting that in Egyptian culture, kind of like the idealized lifespan is 110 years. In Hebrew culture, is 120 years. But in Egyptian culture, it's 110 years. So this kind of tells us that Joseph is viewed more as an Egyptian than as a Jew. Even though he's a Jew, he's really kind of adopted that Egyptian culture. He did see his grandchildren, the children of Ephraim and Manasseh. God will visit you and bring you up out of this land in verse 24, and you should carry my bones from here in verse 25. I think that is just about it. Okay, so here's the other map of the 12 tribes. And again, you see now Simeon is a lot smaller in this map than it was in the previous map. That's probably more accurate because everything down here is just desert. This is probably the functional part of Simeon. And Reuben over here, pretty small too. Now I mentioned that Dan originally was given this land right here. This is, even to this day, this is Philistine or now we would say Palestinian territory because this is where you got Tyron, Sidon, and Ashdod, and Escalon, Gaza, all those, the Gaza Strip, all those little cities, and they got ran out, basically. This is that Judges 18 chapter. And so they went way up here to the north. It was on the other map, it's not on this one, but they're up here where the city of Laish was, and they basically took it over, and that's where Dan is now. If you go there, it's a beautiful place. There's a really nice river that runs through there. There's not much water in Israel, but that's a really nice river, and they have a big park there and everything. It's really, really pretty nice. So they came out good on that deal, getting away from the Philistines and going up north. And that is it. So any questions or comments? We should be right on time. 2 minutes for questions. No? That's a lot. 50 chapters in 13 weeks is a lot. But I appreciate, yeah.
So when are you teaching again?
Am I teaching again? I don't know, Ray. When am I teaching again? Ray tried to talk me into teaching next semester in Exodus. I think I need a break. I'm actually going to try to write a novel next month, so it's going to be pretty busy, writing-wise anyway. So maybe a while later we'll see. I like to teach, so I'm sure Ray can find me something to teach.
We'll keep you on the list.
There you go. Keep me on the list. Don't take me off the list. Well, I appreciate you sticking with me. We got a pretty good class size today. Even, I said that second week, I was wondering if anybody would come back. So you guys are still here 13 weeks later. That's to be commended. So I appreciate it. I've enjoyed this. Usually when I teach, it's because I want to learn something else. I want to get deeper into the text. And this was really good to kind of go back and review for me. So
You got a good job, Rick.
well, thank you. I appreciate it.